welcome back to MadEmmyify True Crime. Today we're talking again, as we are for the whole of the month of April, about the Titanic. This is going to be a four-parter. I can't remember if I said in the last one. But yeah, I've broken it up into four parts. Today is part 3. Part 1 was about Titanic's building. Part 2 was the maiden voyage and the sinking, and part 3 will be the death toll that I didn't get to in part 2, as well as information about the return to New York and the British and US enquiry, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what else will be covered in part 4 at the end. If you haven't seen the other parts of this, there will be a link to both in the description box below. Anyway, I'm gonna dive straight into this one. I'm gonna fire some numbers at you quite quickly, and I apologise, but as part 2 was getting longer and longer, I felt I kind of had to leave the death toll to this, so I just wasn't sandwiching it all in at the end. Of the estimated 2,223 aboard the Titanic, 319 people were in first class, 141 women, 7 children and 171 men. Of those in first class, 199 survived. All the first class women survived, along with 54 men and 6 of the children. In second class, there were 272 passengers, 92 women, 25 children and 155 men. Of those, 117 survived. All second class children survived, as well as 78 women and 13 men. In third class, or steerage, there were 709 passengers, 179 women, 80 children and 450 men. Of those, 172 survived, only 88 women, 25 children and 59 men survived. There were also 9 dogs aboard the Titanic, and of those 2 survived because they were snuck into the lifeboats. There were a Pekingese and a Pomeranian. No, those are the 2 important ones. The survival rate of third class was around 25%. The only section of those aboard with a lower rate of survival was the crew, made up of 918 staff, 22 of which were women and 896 men. Only 215 survived, 20 women and 195 men. None of Titanic's engineering staff survived. Captain Smith went down with the ship, as is tradition, and the ship's orchestra also went down with the ship. They famously played music on the boat deck throughout the sinking to try and keep passengers calm. Now, the crew that survived, this isn't to say that they took the places of passengers that should have got on the boats. They were mostly crew that were either there to sail the lifeboats or had been dismissed from their duties so that they could save themselves. Once the 705 survivors were aboard Carpathia, they were given blankets and coffee before being taken to the dining room. Carpathia's own passengers assisted in the rescue, offering food, accommodation, blankets and words of comfort. Molly Brown set about creating a survivors committee with other first-class survivors and was named as the chairman. The committee worked to secure basic necessities for the second and third class survivors. They managed to raise $10,000 before even reaching New York. She also set about making a list of every survivor along with their country of origin. She would not leave Carpathia until she knew every survivor had a relative, friend, sponsor or embassy to greet them at New York. News of the disaster had rapidly spread on the shore, and Carpathia became the centre of a media storm. She received hundreds of wireless messages addressed to Captain Rostron from relatives and friends of those who had been aboard, asking if this person or that person had been saved. Likewise, the press were sending telegrams demanding details and offering large sums of money for exclusive news about the disaster. Carpathia's Marconi operator, Harold Cotton, also had many of the survivors asking for Marconigrams to be sent to their friends and relatives on shore, announcing that they were safe. Because of this, Cotton found it impossible to clear the air. He worked tirelessly, not sleeping for 2 or 3 days and nights, just sending and receiving messages. Eventually, Harold Bride, who had survived the sinking but was left suffering from shock and exposure, kind of recovered enough to help Cotton so that he could at least get some rest. Captain Rostron had placed strict order that no news stories be sent to the press, as he knew there would probably need to be an official inquiry into the disaster and that any press statements should come from White Star's offices, not him. Luckily, the course of the Olympic was converging with that of Carpathia, and Cotton was able to establish radio communication to send them the list of survivors. Carpathia was limited with their radio signal only having 150-mile range, and that was 150 miles on a good day, like if the weather was clear. A lot of newspapers in New York, unaware of this limitation and the busyness of the operators, wrongly implied that Cunard and White Star were trying to somehow censor information about the disaster. Carpathia's arrival in New York was delayed as they hit storms and fog near Newfoundland, but on Tuesday, April 16th, White Star released their official statement. White Star's offices in London, New York, Montreal, Southampton and Liverpool attracted crowds of people as staff put survivors lists on the chalkboards outside. Southampton was hit the hardest with losses as 1 in 5 crew members were from the town. 4 in 5 crew members were from the town. What am I even on about? On the afternoon of April the 18th, 1912, the fog lifted, and at 6 p.m, Carpathia arrived at the entrance to New York Harbour, where they were greeted by a fleet of 50 small craft, all crowded with news reporters, photographers, relatives and friends of both the dead and survivors, as well as those who were just curious to see what was happening. These ships all converged on Carpathia as an unwanted escort to the pilot boat. To prevent any delays at customs, as well as to protect Titanic survivors from harassment, Captain Rostron gave the order that only the pilot was to board. When Carpathia stopped, the awaiting boats crowded around her, the occupants seemingly expecting Carpathia to lower the gangways and let them aboard. When they realised this wasn't going to happen, there was pandemonium, with reporters yelling questions, some through megaphones, or holding up fists full of money hoping to bribe those on deck to either lower ladders and ropes or to answer questions about the Titanic. Third Officer Reese was stationed at the accommodation ladder, ready to receive the pilot. He soon discovered that 5 reporters had somehow managed to get onto the pilot boat. Reese told them that only the pilot would be allowed to board, and Reese was quite a big man, and he did have to punch 1 or 2 in the jaw to fend them off. The remaining reporters attempted different tactics, one trying to bribe Reese with $200 and another putting soap in his mouth until it frothed and screaming hysterically, my sister was on the Titanic." None of this worked, and the pilot was the only one let aboard. As Carpathia continued into dock, a Cunard tug came to assist them in. The tugmaster had instructed they stop at the White Star Pier and lower the 9 of Titanic's lifeboats they had taken aboard so not to interfere with Carpathia's docking, and they finally docked at 9:30 p.m. at Pier 54. 40,000 people waited in the pouring rain to greet them. A reporter from the Globe did manage to sneak aboard and make his way to the bridge after docking, but he was apprehended by Captain Rostron. He ran into the crowd and escaped before the Marine superintendent could deal with him, though, and he did manage to speak to some of the survivors or some of the passengers on Carpathia and get some news stories out of them. Clothing, transport and shelter were provided to Titanic survivors by many New York-based organisations, though many survivors did not stay in New York but headed to relatives' homes. Some wealthier survivors chartered a train to take them home, while the Pennsylvania Railroad put on a special free train to take people back to Philadelphia. Titanic's surviving crew were taken aboard the SS Lapland. Carpathia was also quickly restocked with food and provisions before resuming her journey. All her crew were given a month's wages by Cunard as a reward for their actions, and some of Titanic's passengers joined together and raised £900, or the equivalent of £90,000 a day, to divide among the crew, and that would have been like an equivalent of a captain's salary essentially divided among them, so it was a fair bit of money. Even before the Carpathia had docked in New York, investigations into what had happened were being planned in both Britain and the USA. The US hearing began on April the 19th, and the inquiry was chaired by William Alden Smith. He had wanted to organise the inquiry as quickly as possible so that the events were still fresh in the minds of both passengers and crew. The subcommittee was made of 6 other senators, 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats, all specifically chosen to represent the views of both parties. Questioning was carried out by various members of the committee at different times rather than all 7 being present at once. However, Smith was the one who personally questioned all of the key witnesses. The SS California, after searching for survivors, had sailed on to Boston unnoticed. The US inquiry didn't actually learn of California's involvement until the second day of the inquiry, when members of California's crew, including Captain Stanley Lord, began leaking stories to the press about seeing Titanic's distress rockets on the night of the sinking. Captain Lord claimed California was 30 miles from Titanic, while other crew reported that they were less than 20 miles from Titanic, though when reporters pressed Lord, he said that their exact location was a state secret. He also gave conflicting stories as to why the wireless telegraph had been turned off. It didn't take long for Lord and California's crew to be subpoenaed to appear at the inquiry. They gave their testimony on April the 23rd, but while the crew all gave the same story, again Lord's was conflicting and incomplete. There was also a scrap log that was missing from California, and their official log did not mention Titanic or any other nearby ship or any rockets. When this all happened, there were 2 schools of opinion: those who thought that Captain Lord was guilty of something and those that thought he was innocent, and those that thought he was innocent were called Lordites. Personally, I think Lord should have, more should have happened to Lord off the back of what happened. The American inquiry took place over 18 days. 86 witnesses were called in that time, and the transcript was over 1,000 pages long. The final report was presented to the US Senate on May the 28th, 1912. It was 19 pages long with 44 pages of exhibits. The report's key findings were that a lack of emergency preparations had left Titanic's passengers and crew in a state of absolute unpreparedness, and the evacuation had been chaotic. The ship's safety and life-saving equipment had not been properly tested. Titanic's captain had shown an indifference to danger that was one of the direct and contributory causes of the unnecessary tragedy. The lack of lifeboats was the fault of the British Board of Trade. The SS California was much nearer to Titanic than the captain is willing to admit, and the British government should take drastic actions against him. Bruce Ismay had not ordered Captain Smith to put on extra speed, but his presence aboard may have contributed to Smith's decision to do so. Third-class passengers had not been prevented from reaching lifeboats, but had in many cases not realised until it was too late that the ship was sinking. The report as a whole was critical of established seafaring practices and the role that Titanic's builders, owners, officers and crew had played in contributing to the disaster. It highlighted arrogance and complacency that was prevalent both on the ship, in the shipping industry itself, and within the British Board of Trade. However, it did not find International Mercantile Marine Company, IMM, which was the company that JP Morgan had set up to try and monopolise shipping, or White Star negligent under the laws that existed at the time. Therefore, the disaster was categorised as an act of God. Senator Smith proposed 3 pieces of legislation. Number 1 was a joint resolution with the House of Representatives to award a Congressional Gold Medal to Captain Rostron. Number 2 was a bill to re-evaluate existing maritime legislation. And number 3 was another joint resolution to set up a commission to investigate the laws and regulations on both the construction and equipment of maritime vessels. The inquiry had also recommended regulations be put in place in regards to wireless telegraphy. This was put in place by the Radio Act of 1912 that mandated all radio stations in the US be licensed by the federal government, as well as mandating that seagoing vessels continue to monitor distress frequencies 24 hours a day. And the Wireless Ship Act of 1910 was also amended, bringing in new regulations around how wireless telegraphs on ships be managed. The British newspapers were heavily critical of the US inquiry and Smith's questioning, which did see him ask Harold Lowe what is an iceberg made of. The inquiry was also seen as an affront to British honour, though it is considered to have been more thorough than the British inquiry, as the British inquiry was essentially the British Board of Trade investigating itself. The British inquiry began on the 2nd of May 1912 and lasted until the 3rd of July. The British inquiry was chaired by Lord Mersey, who was a High Court judge. As part of the British inquiry, nearly 100 witnesses were questioned. Titanic's shipbuilders, Harland and Wolff, provided a 20-foot half model of the ship to assist the inquiry. The Attorney General for England and Wales also provided 26 questions relating to Titanic's construction and voyage. The cost of the British inquiry reached £20,000, which would be £1,676,602 in today's money, and was the longest and most detailed court of inquiry in British history up to that point. I'm fairly sure that that's been overtaken now by probably either Chilcot or the Leveson inquiry, but I don't know. I couldn't find exactly. The final report from the British inquiry came on the 30th of July 1912. The report had a very detailed account of the ship, her journey and the damage caused by the iceberg, as well as an account of the evacuation and rescue. The California also had its own special section within the report too. The British inquiry's findings were very similar to those in the US, with some expansion on the role of the SS California. The British inquiry suggested Captain Lord face a formal inquiry regarding his competency to continue as a master of a British ship, but no legal action was taken against him. That's because it suggested it, but it didn't order it, so there was like a legal loophole there that meant it didn't have to be fully investigated. The British inquiry also criticised but didn't wholly condemn the failures of the British Board of Trade, White Star Line or Captain Smith, saying that Smith had not been negligent as he was following long-standing practices which until that time had not been found unsafe. Though it's not really that surprising that the British Board of Trade didn't find itself at fault, as it was likely trying to avoid numerous lawsuits and the end of British shipping should it find itself guilty of something. And unsurprisingly, the British press were also more receptive of this inquiry. While the US inquiry was still ongoing and before the British inquiry had even begun, White Star chartered 4 ships from Canada to retrieve the bodies from the wreckage. They were the cable ship Mackay Bennett, Minia, which was another cable ship. For some reason, when I read that written down, my mind goes blank on how to pronounce it. The lighthouse supply ship Montgomery and sealing vessel Algerine. Each ship was equipped with embalming supplies, undertakers and clergy. Of the 333 bodies recovered, 328 were recovered by the Canadian ship. Of those ships, the Mackay Bennett found 306, but only 190 of those were brought to shore, with 116 being buried at sea. This was because even with extra embalming supplies, they could not embalm every identifiable body, and only those embalmed could be returned to port. The captain of Mackay Bennett, Captain Lardner, told press he had chosen to leave or return the members of Titanic's crew to the sea, as he himself, as a mariner, would have been contented with that. The crew he had identified by their uniforms. He chose to embalm mostly first-class passengers, as it was felt that it would be best to bring back the bodies of those whose visual identification may be needed to settle land insurance and inheritance claims. When I say identifiable bodies, a lot of the bodies were classed as unidentifiable, not because of bloat, but because of skull and head injuries and broken limbs and stuff like that that had happened during the sinking and that had been caused by debris that had come up from the ship. One of the bodies recovered, although bloat I suppose would have been a factor as well. Anyway, one of the bodies recovered by the Mackay Bennett was that of Isidore Strauss, the co-owner of Macy's department store. He and his wife Ida were travelling in first class. The couple had chosen to go down with the ship and die together when Ida realised that her husband could not join her in the lifeboat. She chose to give her spot to her maid Ellen Bird, as well as her fur coat. Ida's body was unfortunately never recovered, and the maid did eventually return the fur coat to the Strauss family. Now, Ida hadn't given this as like, oh, take my fur, we must save the fur coat. It was, you need this more than me. Like, she was thinking of the poor maid who was going to be in this cold lifeboat all night in a freezing ocean. By the June, the search for bodies was stopped as the life vests, which were made of cloth and cork, had begun to disintegrate, returning the bodies to the deep. 121 of the dead from Titanic were buried at Fairview Cemetery in Nova Scotia. Most of the graves have small granite markers bearing the name and date of death. The most famous of these is that of the unknown child, a 19-month-old toddler who was never claimed. The sailors of the Mackay Bennett paid out of their own pockets for this gravestone. Up until 2002, the child was never identified, but in November 2002, he was initially erroneously identified as 30-month-old Ino Panula, who had been aboard Titanic with 6 members of his family, all who had not survived. However, in 2008, mitochondrial DNA tests showed the unknown child was actually 19-month-old Sydney Goodwin. Again, the whole family had perished aboard Titanic, so there was no one to claim the body, and his was the only one of the Goodwin family which was recovered. It should come as no surprise that in both Britain and the US, more than 60 survivors combined a case to sue White Star for damages relating to loss of life and baggage. There were an estimated $6 million in cash, jewels, bonds and securities aboard Titanic. There were also several personal injury claims made against White Star. The total claims at the time totalled at $2,500,000. That would be around 66 million today. And that's in dollars, sorry, I don't know if I said. White Star eventually settled out of court and agreed to pay $664,000, which would be equivalent to $17 million, $500,000, which would be $13 million today, to be paid directly to American claimants, $50,000 or $1 million to British claimants, and $114,000 or $3 million in today's money dollars for legal expenses. That's all for today. In part 4, I will tell you about what life was like for the survivors kind of afterwards, going forward, the future of the White Star Line after all of this, the recovery, or the discovery rather, of Titanic's wreckage, and kind of the current state, because there's lots of things that have been going on with that even within the last year. And I might talk a little bit about conspiracy theories as well. We shall see. Anyway, that is all for today. I hope I've educated and informed you. I hope that you'll be back for the final part next week. Good night.